The autumn wind carried the faint echoes of carnival music through the streets of Cedar Falls, Iowa, a haunting melody that seemed to drift from another time entirely, but on this crisp October evening in 2024, the sounds weren't coming from any present-day celebration. They were memories stirring in the mind of Marcus Rivera, a 58-year-old Army veteran whose weathered hands trembled slightly as he stared at the yellowed piece of paper that had just changed everything he thought. He knew about the most devastating night of his childhood. 43 years ago, his younger sister Elena had vanished without a trace from the Moonlight Carnival that had rolled into their small town for one magical weekend, leaving behind only questions, heartbreak, and a cryptic note from a fortune teller named Madame Zelda that police had dismissed as the ramblings of a carnival charlatan. But today, thanks to a retired linguistics professor's passion project and advanced computer analysis, that seemingly meaningless scroll of symbols and foreign words had finally revealed its shocking secret, a truth so profound and unexpected that it would not only solve the mystery that had haunted the Rivera family for nearly half a century, but also force Marcus to confront the demons from his own tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq, ultimately leading him on a journey of healing that would prove some disappearances aren't abductions at all, but rather acts of desperate love that transcend time, distance, and understanding. Marcus Rivera had built his entire adult life around discipline, routine, and the kind of rigid structure that the military had drilled into him during his 22 years of service. But beneath the pressed uniforms and precisely made beds lay a foundation cracked by two distinct traumas that had shaped every decision he'd made since childhood. The first trauma occurred when he was just 12 years old, walking hand in hand with his 8-year-old sister Elena through the swirling lights and intoxicating aromas of the Moonlight Carnival on that fateful October night in 1981, when a moment of distraction, a clown juggling flaming torches, caused him to loosen his grip on her small fingers just long enough for her to slip away into the crowd, vanishing as completely as if the earth had swallowed her whole. The second trauma came decades later, during his third deployment to Afghanistan, when an IED explosion killed 3 of his closest friends and left him with a purple heart, a pronounced limp, and survivor's guilt that made him question why he deserved to come home when so many others didn't, creating a double burden of responsibility and loss that had turned him into a man who meticulously controlled every aspect of his environment because chaos had already stolen too much from him. After retiring from the army in 2019, Marcus had returned to Cedar Falls and settled into a quiet existence in the same modest ranch house where he'd grown up, maintaining his parents' property with military precision while working part-time as a security consultant for local businesses, a job that allowed him to use his tactical skills while avoiding the deep emotional connections that might leave him vulnerable to more loss. His daily routine was as predictable as sunrise. Wake at 500 hours, physical training for 90 minutes, shower and breakfast, review security reports at his kitchen table until noon, lunch consisting of the same sandwich and coffee, afternoon, maintenance work around the house or consulting calls, dinner at exactly 1800 hours, and evening television programs that required no emotional investment. Crime procedurals with clear-cut solutions and predictable outcomes that provided a stark contrast to the messy uncertainties that had defined too much of his real life. The only deviation from this schedule came on October 15th each year, the anniversary of Elena's disappearance, when Marcus would drive to Riverside Cemetery and spend exactly 1 hour at his parents' grave, updating them on his life and apologizing once again for losing their daughter, a ritual that had become both penance and prayer in the years since their deaths had left him as the sole keeper of Elena's memory. Marcus rarely spoke about Elena to anyone, partly because the pain remained too raw even after 4 decades, but mostly because he'd learned that people didn't know how to respond to stories about missing children, their faces invariably shifting from curiosity to discomfort as they struggled to find appropriate words of comfort or hope that wouldn't sound hollow or presumptuous. The few times he'd tried to discuss the case with local law enforcement over the years, he'd been met with sympathetic but clear explanations that missing persons cases from 1981 were essentially cold files, archived in dusty boxes with little chance of resolution unless new evidence emerged. And while DNA technology had revolutionized criminal investigation, it required having something to test against, some physical trace that could connect Elena to a specific location or perpetrator. The carnival itself had been a small operation that folded within 2 years of Elena's disappearance, its owner dying in a car accident in 1984, and most of the performers and workers had scattered to other shows or left the carnival life entirely, taking with them any memories or insights that might have helped solve the mystery of what happened to a little girl in a yellow sundress who simply walked into a crowd and never walked out. The transformation in Marcus's carefully ordered world began on a Tuesday morning in early October 2024, when his doorbell rang at precisely 0847 hours, interrupting his review of incident reports from the shopping center where he consulted on security protocols. Standing on his front porch was Dr. Sarah Kim, a woman in her mid-50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of intense, intelligent eyes that suggested she was accustomed to solving complex puzzles that others had given up on. Introducing herself as a retired professor of linguistics from the University of Iowa, who had spent the past 5 years working on a volunteer project to decode historical documents and mysterious texts that had stumped investigators and researchers. For decades, Dr. Kim explained that she'd obtained his contact information from the Cedar Falls Police Department after expressing interest in reviewing unsolved cases that involved written communications or symbols, and she'd been particularly intrigued by a file from 1981 that mentioned a fortune teller's note connected to a missing child case, asking if he might be willing to discuss the circumstances surrounding his sister's disappearance and the cryptic message that police had dismissed as meaningless. Un carnival theatrics. Marcus's initial reaction was skepticism, mixed with the protective instinct that had kept him from getting his hopes up about Elena's case for more than 2 decades. But something about Dr. Kim's straightforward manner and obvious expertise convinced him to invite her inside, where she spread several photocopied documents across his kitchen table and began explaining her methodology for analyzing historical texts that contained multiple languages, symbolic representations, and cultural references that weren't immediately apparent to casual observers. The fortune teller's note, she explained, had been written in a combination of Romani, Spanish, and what appeared to be an invented symbolic code, layered together in a way that suggested the author was either highly educated or deeply steeped in multiple cultural traditions. And while the original police investigation had focused on the surface meaning of the text, something about safe journeys and family protection, Dr. Kim's analysis had revealed additional layers of meaning that only became apparent when the entire message was treated as a complex cipher rather than a simple blessing or curse. According to Dr. Kim's research, Madame Zelda hadn't been the stereotypical carnival fortune teller that police reports had suggested, but rather a woman named Isabella Restrepo, who had fled Colombia in the late 1970s with her own daughter after her husband was killed by drug cartels, using the carnival circuit as a way to move constantly and avoid detection while building a new identity in the United States. The symbolic elements in her note, which had looked like decorative flourishes to the original investigators, were actually a sophisticated system for recording locations and contacts within a network of people who helped vulnerable individuals. disappear when their safety was threatened, a kind of underground railroad that operated through traveling circuses, carnivals, and other mobile communities that could provide transportation and anonymity to those who needed to vanish completely. When Dr. Kim applied modern computational linguistics to the full text, cross-referencing the symbols with historical maps and immigration records, a startling picture emerged. The note wasn't a mystical pronouncement about Elena's fate, but rather detailed instructions for how a frightened child could be safely transported to a specific location where she would be cared for by people who specialized in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow, forcing him to sit down heavily in his kitchen chair as the implications crashed over him in waves of shock, confusion, and the first glimmer of hope he'd allowed himself to feel about Elena's fate in over 4 decades. If Dr. Kim's interpretation was correct, Elena hadn't been abducted by a stranger or murdered by some carnival predator. She had been rescued by someone who recognized that she was in danger and acted to save her life, using a sophisticated network that had operated in secret for years, helping vulnerable people disappear safely when conventionous. Dr. Kim acknowledged that her decoding of the fortune-teller's note was just the beginning of what would need to be a much more extensive investigation. But she'd already begun reaching out to historians who specialized in documenting underground networks that had operated during the 1980s, as well as genealogists who might be able to trace the movements of carnival personnel from that era. The note included what appeared to be coded references to specific locations along the East Coast, particularly in areas with established Latino communities where a Spanish-speaking child might blend in more easily. And while many of these communities had changed dramatically over the past 4 decades, there were still records, still people who might remember a little girl who arrived under mysterious circumstances and was quietly integrated into a new family structure designed to keep her safe from whatever threat had necessitated her disappearance in the first place. Marcus found himself caught between overwhelming gratitude for Dr. Kim's expertise and dedication, and a paralyzing fear that pursuing this new lead might ultimately prove even more devastating than accepting Elena's disappearance as an unsolved mystery. For 43 years, he'd lived with the terrible uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to his sister. But he'd also found a way to function within that uncertainty, building a life structured around accepted loss and controlled expectations that allowed him to honor Elena's memory without being consumed by false hopes or impossible quests. Now suddenly he was faced with the possibility that Elena might be alive, might have been living a full life somewhere else while he'd been mourning her as dead. And the emotional complexity of that possibility was almost too much to process. Relief that she might have been safe all along, guilt that he'd never found her, anger that no one had told him she was protected, and a desperate, terrifying hope that he might actually get the chance to see her again. As Dr. Kim gathered her papers and prepared to leave, she handed Marcus a business card and a folder containing copies of all her research on the fortune-teller's note, explaining that she understood this was an enormous amount of information to absorb, and that he should take whatever time he needed to decide whether he wanted to pursue the investigation further. She also warned him that even if they were able to trace Elena's movements through the underground network, there was no guarantee that she would want to be found. People who had been helped to disappear often had very good reasons for staying. Hidden and respecting their choice to remain anonymous was a fundamental principle of the organizations that had protected them. The decision of whether to continue searching would ultimately be Marcus's to make, but Dr. Kim wanted him to know that if he chose to move forward, he wouldn't be alone in the process, and she was committed to helping him find answers regardless of where the investigation might lead. After Dr. Kim left, Marcus sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the photocopied fortune-teller's note that had just transformed from a meaningless relic into a roadmap that might lead him back to his sister, feeling simultaneously more hopeful and more terrified than he'd been since the night Elena disappeared. The carefully constructed walls of routine and emotional distance that had protected him for decades suddenly felt inadequate for containing the flood of possibilities that Dr. Kim's research had unleashed. And for the first time in years, Marcus began to wonder whether the disciplined isolation he'd maintained since returning from the military might actually be holding him back from the kind of healing and connection that Elena's story seemed to represent. The possibility that love and protection could transcend time and distance, that families separated by impossible circumstances might still find their way back to each other, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was allow themselves to hope for a miracle they'd never dared to imagine. The weight of Dr. Kim's revelations settled over Marcus, like the fog that often rolled through Cedar Falls during autumn evenings, obscuring familiar landmarks and making him question everything he thought he knew about the landscape of his own life. And as he sat in his kitchen, staring at the fortune-teller's note that had just been transformed from meaningless scribbles into a potential roadmap to his missing sister, he realized that for the first time in decades, he needed to hear from people who might understand the magnitude of what he was facing. Marcus had spent most of his adult life avoiding the kind of vulnerability that came with sharing deeply personal struggles. But the possibility that Elena might be alive somewhere, living a life he knew nothing about while he'd spent 43 years mourning her as dead, created an emotional tsunami that his usual coping mechanisms simply couldn't contain. And he found himself reaching for his phone with the kind of desperate need for connection that he'd successfully suppressed since his return from Afghanistan. His first call was to Tommy Hernandez, his former squad leader and the only person from his military service with whom Marcus had maintained regular contact, a man who'd helped him navigate the transition from active duty to civilian life, and who possessed the kind of unshakable calm that came from having survived multiple deployments and the subsequent challenges of rebuilding a life stateside. Tommy answered on the second ring with his characteristic blend of warmth and directness, immediately sensing from Marcus's tone that this wasn't their usual monthly check-in about VA benefits or job opportunities. And when Marcus began explaining about Dr. Kim's visit and the decoded fortune-teller's note, Tommy listened without interruption, understanding instinctively that his friend needed someone to witness this moment rather than offer solutions or advice. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, with Marcus finding himself describing not just the recent developments, but also memories of Elena that he'd kept locked away for decades. Her laugh when she rode the carousel at the carnival, her habit of collecting smooth stones from the creek behind their house, the way she would climb into his bed after nightmares and ask him to tell her stories about brave knights and rescued princesses until she fell asleep feeling safe and protected. Tommy's response was exactly what Marcus needed to hear. Validation that the situation was genuinely extraordinary and potentially life-changing. Acknowledgement that the emotional complexity was overwhelming and completely understandable. And practical advice about taking things one step at a time, rather than trying to process all the implications at once. More importantly, Tommy reminded Marcus that he'd already survived the worst thing he could imagine, losing Elena in the first place. And that whatever he discovered now, whether Elena was alive or had died years ago after being safely relocated, at least he would finally have answers, instead of spending the rest of his life wondering what might have been. The conversation ended with Tommy's promise to be available whenever Marcus needed to talk through the next steps, and his gentle suggestion that Marcus might want to consider reaching out to other people who cared about him. since navigating this kind of emotional territory was easier with a support network than trying to handle everything alone. The second call Marcus made was to his neighbour, Mrs. Catherine Walsh, a retired schoolteacher in her 70s who had lived next door to the Rivera family for over 50 years and who possessed the kind of institutional memory that made her an invaluable resource for understanding the social dynamics of Cedar Falls during the early 1980s. Mrs. Walsh had been one of the few people who continued checking on Marcus's parents after Elena's disappearance, bringing casseroles during the worst months and sitting with his mother during the long afternoons when grief made even simple conversations feel impossible, and she'd maintained that supportive presence even after Marcus's parents died, treating him with the kind of maternal concern that he'd never quite known how to accept or reciprocate. When Marcus explained about Dr. Kim's research and asked if she remembered anything unusual about the carnival or the fortune teller, Mrs. Walsh surprised him by revealing that she'd actually spoken with Madame Zelda on the night Elena disappeared, seeking advice about her own daughter, who was going through a difficult divorce and custody battle at the time. According to Mrs. Walsh's recollection, Madame Zelda had been nothing like the stereotypical carnival fortune teller portrayed in police reports, but rather a sophisticated woman who spoke several languages fluently and seemed genuinely concerned about the safety and welfare of the families who consulted with her, offering practical advice about legal resources and community support networks rather than vague predictions about future romance or financial success. Mrs. Walsh remembered being impressed by the woman's knowledge of immigration law and social services, unusual expertise for someone supposedly making a living reading palms and tarot cards, and she'd left the encounter feeling that Madame Zelda was someone who had extensive experience helping people navigate complex personal crises, rather than simply entertaining carnival visitors with mystical theatrics. Even more significantly, Mrs. Walsh recalled seeing Elena talking with Madame Zelda earlier in the evening before she disappeared, and she'd observed that the fortune teller seemed particularly attentive to the little girl, asking questions about her family and showing the kind of focused concern that suggested she might have identified some reason for worry that wasn't apparent to the adults around them. This new information from Mrs. Walsh added another layer of complexity to Marcus's understanding of what might have happened that night, suggesting that Elena's disappearance might not have been a spontaneous rescue, but rather the result of a more deliberate assessment and intervention by someone with experience identifying children who were at risk. The possibility that Madame Zelda had recognized some threat to Elena's safety that even her own family hadn't perceived was both comforting and deeply unsettling, raising questions about what kind of danger could have been present in their seemingly normal small-town life, and whether Marcus's parents had been aware of any circumstances that might have put Elena at risk. Mrs. Walsh gently suggested that there might have been family dynamics or community situations that Marcus had been too young to understand at the time, and she offered to help him research newspaper archives and school records from that period if he wanted to develop a more complete picture of what Cedar Falls was like during the months leading up to Elena's disappearance. The third conversation Marcus initiated was with Father Miguel Santos, the priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church, where the Rivera family had been regular attendees throughout Marcus's childhood, and where his parents had held a memorial service for Elena on the first anniversary of her disappearance, when it became clear that the police investigation wasn't going to yield any immediate answers. Father Santos had known the Rivera family for decades and had provided spiritual counseling to Marcus's parents during the worst periods of their grief. And he possessed the kind of pastoral insight that came from having shepherded his congregation. through countless personal tragedies and family crises over the course of his 40-year ministry. When Marcus explained about the decoded fortune-teller's note and the possibility that Elena had been rescued rather than abducted, Father Santos listened with the kind of careful attention that reflected both his pastoral training and his genuine affection for the Rivera family, asking thoughtful questions about Dr. Kim's research methodology and the reliability of her linguistic analysis. Father Santos revealed that he'd actually had his own suspicions about the official narrative surrounding Elena's disappearance, based on conversations he'd had with Marcus's parents in the years following the incident, particularly with Marcus's mother, who had mentioned several times that she felt Elena had been trying to tell her something important in the weeks before the carnival, but had never been able to articulate what was troubling her. According to Father Santos, Mrs. Rivera had worried that Elena might have witnessed something or been approached by someone in a way that made her feel unsafe, but the little girl had been too young or too frightened to explain the situation, clearly leaving her mother with only vague concerns that she'd dismissed as normal childhood anxiety until after Elena disappeared, and those concerns took on much more ominous significance. Father Santos also mentioned that there had been several transient workers in Cedar Falls during the summer of 1981, men who had come to town for construction projects and agricultural work. And while there hadn't been any specific incidents reported to police, there had been informal concerns expressed by parents about strangers who seemed to pay unusual attention to local children. The priest's recollections added another dimension to Marcus's growing understanding of the context surrounding Elena's disappearance, suggesting that Madame Zelda might have recognized signs of potential danger that the adults in Elena's life had noticed but not fully understood, and that her intervention might have been motivated by specific threats rather than general concerns about child welfare. Father Santos offered to help Marcus research church records and community bulletins from 1981 that might contain additional information about the social environment in Cedar Falls during that period, and he also suggested that Marcus might want to consider the spiritual implications of discovering that his sister had been protected rather than harmed, framing this revelation as a potential answer to decades of prayers, rather than simply a cold case breakthrough that happened to involve sophisticated criminal networks. The final call Marcus made that evening was to his cousin Maria Elena Vasquez, who lived in Phoenix and was the only other surviving member of his immediate family, a woman 10 years older than Marcus, who had served as something of a big sister figure after Elena's disappearance and who had maintained the kind of regular contact that provided continuity and emotional stability, even when geographic distance made frequent visits impossible. Maria Elena had been in college when Elena disappeared, but she'd come home for several weeks to help with the search efforts and to provide support to Marcus's parents during the initial crisis, and she'd continued to be a source of strength and perspective for the family throughout the long years of uncertainty that followed. When Marcus called to tell her about Dr. Kim's research and the possibility that Elena might be alive, Maria Elena's response was a mixture of excitement, concern, and practical questions about what steps should be taken next and how the family should prepare for whatever they might discover. Maria Elena reminded Marcus that pursuing this investigation would inevitably bring up painful memories and unresolved emotions for everyone involved. Not just for him, but potentially for Elena herself, if she was indeed alive and had built a new life based on staying hidden from her original family. And she urged him to consider working with a professional counselor or therapist who could help him navigate the psychological complexities of this situation, regardless of what the investigation ultimately revealed. She also pointed out that if Elena had been living under a different identity for 43 years, she might have children and grandchildren who knew nothing about her original family, and that any reunion would need to be handled with extraordinary sensitivity to avoid disrupting the life she'd built while staying safe from whatever threat had originally necessitated her disappearance. The conversation with Maria Elena lasted well into the evening, covering not just the immediate implications of Dr. Kim's discovery, but also broader questions about family, identity, and the ways that love and protection could manifest in unexpected forms. And by the time Marcus hung up the phone, he felt both more prepared to move forward with the investigation and more aware of the profound challenges that lay ahead. The support and insights he'd received from Tommy, Mrs. Walsh, Father Santos, and Maria Elena had helped him process the initial shock of learning that Elena's disappearance might have been a rescue rather than an abduction, but they'd also made clear that this was just the beginning of what would likely be a long and emotionally demanding journey toward understanding what had really happened that night at the carnival, and whether there was any possibility of reconnecting with the sister he'd lost so many years ago. As Marcus prepared for bed that night, he found himself looking at the fortune-teller's note with new eyes, seeing it not as a cryptic relic from a traumatic past, but as a potential bridge between the family he'd lost and the future he'd never dared to imagine. And for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to hope that the discipline and resilience he'd developed through military service and personal tragedy might finally serve a purpose that involved healing and reunion rather than simply survival. And emotional management. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Marcus's bedroom at exactly 5:30 hours, the same time his internal clock had been waking him for the past 25 years. But for the first time since his retirement from the army, he found himself lying in bed staring at the ceiling instead of immediately launching into his rigorous morning routine, his mind churning with the implications of Dr. Kim's visit and the conversations he'd had the previous evening with people who had helped him begin to process the earth-shattering possibility that Elena might be alive somewhere, living a life he knew nothing about while he'd spent 4 decades constructing his own existence around the assumption that she was gone forever. The carefully maintained structure that had governed every aspect of his daily life suddenly felt inadequate for containing the emotional upheaval that this new information had unleashed. And as Marcus finally forced himself out of bed and began his morning exercises, he realized that he was going to need to fundamentally reconsider not just his understanding of Elena's disappearance, but also his own identity as the grieving brother who had failed to protect her when she needed him most. Marcus Rivera had been born into a family that embodied the American dream in its most traditional form, with parents who had immigrated from Mexico in the early 1960s and worked multiple jobs to establish themselves in Cedar Falls, a small Iowa town that offered the kind of economic opportunities and social stability that had seemed impossible in the rural village where they'd grown up, surrounded by poverty and limited prospects for advancement. His father, Carlos Rivera, had started as a janitor at the local meatpacking plant and eventually worked his way up to supervisor, while his mother, Rosa Rivera, had cleaned houses during the day and taken in sewing at night until she saved enough money to open a small alteration shop that became a gathering place for the town's growing Latino community, providing not just clothing services, but also informal translation help, job referrals, and the kind of cultural connection that made the transition to American life feel less isolating and overwhelming for families who were navigating between two worlds with limited resources and uncertain legal status. The Rivera household had been characterized by the kind of warmth discipline, and high expectations that reflected Carlos and Rosa's determination to ensure their children would have access to opportunities that had been denied to previous generations, and Marcus had grown up understanding that education, hard work and respectful behavior were not just personal choices but family obligations that honored the sacrifices his parents had made to give him and Elena a better life than they'd had in Mexico. Both children had been excellent students who participated in school activities, helped with the family business, and attended church regularly, creating the kind of stable, achievement-oriented family dynamic that made them well regarded in their community and seemed to promise a future filled with college scholarships, professional careers, and the kind of upward mobility that justified all the struggles and compromises their parents had endured during their early years in America. Elena had been the family's bright star, a precocious 8-year-old who excelled in school, spoke both English and Spanish fluently, and possessed the kind of natural charisma that made adults smile and other children want to be her friend. But she'd also displayed a sensitivity and intuitive understanding of people's emotions that sometimes worried her parents because she seemed to absorb the stress and anxiety of everyone around her, becoming quiet and withdrawn whenever there were family conflicts or community tensions that most children her age wouldn't even notice. Marcus remembered how Elena would sometimes crawl into his bed at night, not because she'd had a nightmare, but because she'd sensed that he was worried about something, a difficult test, a problem with friends, or the subtle financial pressures that their parents tried to hide from their children, and she would lie next to him in the darkness, not saying anything, but somehow providing the kind of comfort and reassurance that made whatever he'd been anxious about seem manageable and temporary. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Elena had begun displaying behaviors that their parents had initially attributed to normal developmental changes, becoming more reserved around strangers, asking unusual questions about family safety, and showing reluctance to participate in activities that required her to be away from home for extended periods. But Marcus now realized that these changes might have been responses to some threat or situation that she'd been too young to articulate clearly, but old enough to recognize as dangerous. He remembered several incidents during the summer of 1981 when Elena had suddenly stopped playing outside and come into the house looking frightened, claiming that someone had been watching her from across the street. But when their parents investigated, they never found anyone suspicious and eventually dismissed her concerns as an overactive imagination triggered by a scary movie or a story she'd heard at school. There had also been changes in Elena's relationship with certain adults in their community, particularly her sudden reluctance to stay after school for activities supervised by Mr. Peterson, the janitor who had always been friendly to students and who had previously been one of Elena's favorite school employees because he would let her help with small tasks and would tell her stories about his own grandchildren who lived in another state. Marcus remembered his parents having quiet conversations about Elena's behavior, with his mother expressing concern that something might have happened to make Elena uncomfortable around Mr. Peterson, but his father had dismissed these worries as typical parental overprotection, pointing out that Peterson had worked at the school for over 15 years without any complaints, and that Elena was probably just going through a phase of being more selective about which adults she trusted. The economic circumstances of the Rivera family during 1981 had also been more precarious than Marcus had understood at the time, with the meatpacking plant, where his father worked facing potential layoffs due to changes in federal regulations and competition from larger operations in other states, while his mother's alterations business had been struggling because many of her regular customers were themselves facing financial difficulties and were making their clothes last longer rather than paying for repairs and adjustments. These financial pressures had created tension between his parents that they'd tried to hide from their children. But Elena's sensitivity to emotional undercurrents had made her aware that something was wrong, even when she couldn't understand the specific nature of the problem, leading to increased anxiety and hypervigilance that might have made her more susceptible to recognizing other threats in their environment that adults were too distracted or overwhelmed to notice. Marcus also remembered that there had been several new families who had moved to Cedar Falls during 1981, including some individuals whose backgrounds and employment situations had been unclear to longtime residents, creating the kind of social uncertainty that often accompanied economic instability in small communities where everyone was expected to know everyone else's business and where strangers were viewed with suspicion until they proved themselves trustworthy through consistent behavior and community involvement. Some of these newcomers had been single men who worked temporary construction jobs or seasonal agricultural work, living in cheap motels or rented rooms, and socializing primarily in halls that catered to transient workers rather than participating in the church and school activities that served as the main social networks for established families with children. The carnival that had come to Cedar Falls in October 1981 had arrived during this period of economic and social uncertainty, setting up in the vacant lot behind the old grain elevator where it would be visible from downtown, but far enough from residential neighborhoods to minimize noise complaints and traffic disruption. And Marcus now realized that the timing and location of the carnival might have made it particularly attractive to individuals who were looking for opportunities to exploit vulnerable children without being noticed by parents and community leaders who were already overwhelmed by their own financial and personal challenges. The fact that Madame Zelda had apparently been operating as part of an underground network designed to protect people who were at risk suggested that she might have recognized patterns of predatory behavior or specific threats that weren't obvious. To local authorities who were focused on more conventional law enforcement priorities and who might not have been trained to identify the subtle signs of child exploitation or abuse. Marcus's memories of his own behavior during the months before Elena's disappearance revealed a troubling pattern of typical adolescent self-absorption that had made him less attentive to his sister's emotional needs and more focused on his own social and academic concerns, particularly his efforts to make the junior high basketball team and his growing interest in a girl named Jennifer Martinez, who sat behind him in English class and who had finally started acknowledging his existence. After months of awkward attempts at conversation, he remembered feeling annoyed when Elena would interrupt his homework or phone conversations to seek comfort or attention, and he'd often brushed off her concerns about scary strangers or uncomfortable situations as childish fears that she needed to overcome if she was going to succeed in middle school, where emotional resilience and social independence were considered essential skills for navigating the complex dynamics of adolescent peer relationships. The night of Elena's disappearance had been particularly difficult for Marcus because he'd been dealing with his own disappointment about not making the basketball team, a rejection that had felt devastating to his 12-year-old sense of identity and social status. And he'd agreed to take Elena to the carnival primarily because his parents had promised him $5 for babysitting, and because he'd hoped that being seen with his cute younger sister might make him appear more mature and responsible to any classmates who might be there with their own families or friends. He remembered feeling impatient with Elena's cautious approach to the carnival rides and games, wanting to appear more adventurous and sophisticated than her careful evaluation of each attraction would allow, and he'd deliberately chosen to stand near the group of older kids who were watching the flame juggler specifically because he wanted to be noticed and accepted by peers whose approval had become more important to him than his sister's safety or emotional comfort. The moment when Elena slipped away from him had happened so quickly that Marcus had initially assumed she'd simply wandered a few steps away to get a better view of the performance. And it wasn't until the flame juggler finished his act and the crowd began to disperse that Marcus realized Elena was nowhere to be seen, triggering a panic that had intensified with each passing minute as his increasingly frantic searches through the carnival grounds failed to locate her among the swirling lights, laughing families, and maze of attractions that had seemed magical just moments before, but now felt sinister and threatening. The guilt and self-recrimination that had followed Elena's disappearance had shaped every major decision Marcus had made since that night, from his choice to join the military immediately after high school to his decision to remain single and avoid situations where he might be responsible for protecting someone else he cared about, creating a life structure designed to prevent him from ever again experiencing the devastating combination of failure and loss that had defined his transition from childhood to adolescence. Now, as Marcus stood in his kitchen preparing the same breakfast he'd eaten every morning for the past 5 years, 2 scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and black coffee, he found himself questioning not just his understanding of what had happened to Elena, but also his fundamental assumptions about his own role in her disappearance and the ways that guilt and grief had shaped his adult identity, wondering whether the disciplined isolation he'd maintained for decades had been necessary, protection or self-imposed punishment that had prevented him from developing the kinds of relationships and connections that might have helped him heal from his childhood trauma, while also honoring Elena's memory in more positive and constructive ways. The phone call came at exactly 09:45 hours on Wednesday morning, 3 days after Dr. Kim's initial visit, and Marcus answered with his characteristic military precision, despite the fact that his carefully maintained routine had been thoroughly disrupted by the emotional earthquake that had shaken the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his sister's disappearance, his own role in that tragic night, and the 43 years of guilt and grief that had shaped his adult life into a monument of disciplined solitude and controlled remembrance. Dr. Kim's voice carried an urgency that immediately commanded Marcus's attention, cutting through the morning fog of his thoughts about Elena's sensitivity to danger, his parents' financial struggles, and the community dynamics that might have created the perfect storm of circumstances that led to his sister vanishing from the Moonlight Carnival on a night that had started with such promise and ended with such devastating loss. Dr. Kim explained that she'd spent the past 3 days conducting intensive research into the underground network that Madame Zelda had apparently been part of, reaching out to historians who specialized in documenting informal protection systems that had operated during the 1980s, genealogists who tracked family migrations during periods of social upheaval, and retired social workers who had been involved in child welfare cases that involved unusual circumstances or creative solutions, to bureaucratic limitations that sometimes prevented conventional agencies from providing adequate protection to vulnerable children. Her investigation had uncovered a fascinating and previously undocumented network of individuals and organizations that had worked together to provide emergency relocation services for people who were facing immediate threats that couldn't be addressed through normal legal channels, operating with the kind of sophistication and resources that suggested extensive experience in helping people disappear safely and establish new identities in communities where they could rebuild their lives without fear of being found by those who had endangered them. The network had apparently been established in the late 1970s by a coalition of immigrants' rights activists, domestic violence counselors, and child protection advocates who had become frustrated with the limitations of existing social services and law enforcement responses to cases involving vulnerable individuals who needed immediate relocation, but who couldn't access conventional witness protection programs or refugee resettlement services due to citizenship status, bureaucratic delays, or the nature of the threats they were facing. According to Dr. Kim's research, the network had developed sophisticated protocols for identifying people who were at risk, evaluating the legitimacy of their need for protection, and facilitating their safe transportation to communities where volunteer families or organizations could provide temporary shelter, while more permanent arrangements were established, all while maintaining the kind of operational security that would prevent their activities from being detected or disrupted by individuals or groups who might seek to exploit or harm the people they were trying to help. Madame Zelda, whose real name was Isabella Restrepo, had been one of the network's most effective operatives, using her position as a traveling carnival fortune teller to identify vulnerable children and families, while also providing a mobile communication system that allowed different nodes of the network to coordinate their activities and share information about emerging threats or successful relocations. Dr. Kim had discovered that Isabella had been particularly skilled at recognizing signs of child abuse and exploitation that weren't immediately obvious to untrained observers, drawing on her own experience as a survivor of domestic violence and her background in psychology and social work that she'd obtained before fleeing Colombia with her own daughter and joining the carnival circuit as a way to stay mobile and avoid detection by the drug cartel that had killed her husband for refusing to cooperate with their money laundering operations. The specific location references in the Decoded fortune teller's note pointed to a small town called Esperanza Springs in North Carolina, a community that had been established in the early 1980s by a Catholic charity organization that specialized in providing housing and support services for refugee families and individuals who had been relocated due to safety concerns, creating a kind of intentional community where people could rebuild their lives while maintaining the anonymity and protection they needed to stay safe from whatever threats had necessitated their disappearance from their original homes and families. Dr. Kim had been able to contact Father Antonio Morales, who had been the director of the Esperanza Springs program during the 1980s and who was now retired but still living in the area, and he had confirmed that the community had indeed provided sanctuary for a number of children during that period, including several who had been relocated through the informal network that Isabella Restrepo had been part of. Father Morales had agreed to meet with Dr. Kim and Marcus if they were willing to travel to North Carolina, but he had also warned that his ability to provide specific information about individual cases would be limited by confidentiality concerns. And the passage of time, since many of the records from that era had been deliberately destroyed to protect the privacy and safety of the people who had been helped by the program. And since some of the individuals who had been relocated might have specifically requested that their new identities and locations never be revealed, even to family members who were searching for them with good intentions. The priest had emphasized that any investigation would need to be conducted with extraordinary sensitivity to the possibility that Elena, if she had indeed been brought to Esperanza Springs, might have built a life based on staying hidden from her original family and community, and that disturbing that carefully constructed anonymity could potentially put her at risk even decades after her initial relocation. Dr. Kim's research had also uncovered troubling information about the social environment in Cedar Falls during the months leading up to Elena's disappearance, including police reports and newspaper articles that had documented a pattern of concerning behavior by several men who had been working temporary jobs in the area during the summer and fall of 1981, individuals whose backgrounds and employment histories had raised questions among some community members, but who had never been formally investigated or charged with any crimes. One man in particular a construction worker named Dale Morrison, who had been hired to help with renovations at the elementary school where Elena was a student, had been the subject of informal complaints from several parents who felt uncomfortable with his interactions with their children. But these concerns had never been reported to police or school administrators because the parents involved had been reluctant to make accusations without concrete evidence, and because Morrison's supervisor had dismissed the complaints as misunderstandings or overreactions from overprotective parents. Morrison had left Cedar Falls abruptly in mid-October 1981, just days after Elena's disappearance, claiming that he'd been offered a better job in another state. But Dr. Kim's investigation had revealed that he'd actually been arrested for child molestation in Kansas 3 months later, suggesting that his departure from Cedar Falls might have been motivated by awareness that he was about to be exposed or investigated for inappropriate behavior with local children. The timing of Morrison's departure and the subsequent arrest created a compelling circumstantial case that Elena might have been identified as one of his potential victims, and that Isabella Restrepo's intervention might have been specifically designed to protect her from imminent sexual abuse or exploitation that conventional authorities hadn't yet recognized or acted upon. The revelation that Elena's disappearance might have been a rescue operation designed to protect her from a specific predator rather than a general precautionary measure hit Marcus with the force of a physical blow, forcing him to sit down heavily in his kitchen chair as the implications crashed over him in waves of relief, horror, and renewed guilt about his failure to recognize the danger his sister had been facing. If Dr. Kim's research was accurate, Elena hadn't simply vanished into some abstract threat, but had been saved from a concrete and immediate danger that could have destroyed her childhood and traumatized her for life. And the mysterious network that had spirited her away to safety had potentially prevented her from becoming another victim of a serial predator who had continued his pattern of abuse in other communities until he was finally caught and prosecuted. But this new information also raised profound questions about why Marcus's parents had never been told about their daughter's relocation, why the network had chosen to let the Rivera family suffer decades of uncertainty and grief rather than providing some kind of reassurance that Elena was safe, and whether there might have been additional threats or circumstances that had made complete secrecy necessary, even at the cost of devastating the family members who loved Elena and had spent their entire lives wondering what had happened to her. Dr. Kim acknowledged that these were difficult ethical questions that didn't have easy answers, but she suggested that the decision to maintain complete separation might have been motivated by concerns about operational security that were designed to protect not just Elena but also other children and families who had been helped by the network, ensuring that no information could be extracted or compromised that might endanger people whose safety depended on their ability to remain completely invisible to those who meant them harm. The possibility of traveling to North Carolina to meet with Father Morales and potentially discover what had happened to Elena after her rescue from Cedar Falls represented both the opportunity Marcus had been hoping for since childhood and the kind of emotional risk that his carefully constructed adult life had been designed to avoid, forcing him to confront the fundamental question of whether he was prepared to handle whatever truth he might discover about his sister's fate and his own role in the events that had led to her disappearance. Dr. Kim had made it clear that there were no guarantees about what they might learn from their investigation, and that even if they were able to confirm that Elena had been brought to Esperanza Springs, there was no certainty that she was still alive or that she would want to reconnect with the family she'd been separated from 4 decades earlier under such traumatic and complicated circumstances. Marcus found himself torn between the desperate need to finally get answers about Elena's fate and the paralyzing fear that those answers might be more painful than the uncertainty he'd lived with for so long, particularly if he discovered that Elena had indeed been alive all these years, but had chosen not to contact him or their parents because she blamed them for failing to protect her from the danger that had necessitated her rescue. The possibility that Elena might have spent decades believing that her family had abandoned her or failed to love her enough to keep her safe was almost more devastating than the assumption that she had died, because it suggested that his guilt and grief had been justified, and that his lifelong sense of having failed in his most important responsibility as a big brother reflected an accurate assessment of his character and capabilities. But Marcus also recognized that this investigation represented his only chance to honor the promise he'd made to Elena on the night she disappeared, when he'd sworn to himself that he would never stop looking for her and would never give up hope, that she might somehow find her way back to the family who loved her. And he realized that his military training and life experience had prepared him to handle difficult truths and complex emotions in ways that his 12-year-old self couldn't have imagined when he first committed himself to finding his missing sister. The discipline and resilience he developed through combat deployments and personal tragedy had taught him that facing reality, however painful, was ultimately less destructive than living in denial or avoidance, and that the kind of healing and growth he'd experienced in his recovery from PTSD and survivor's guilt might also be possible in his relationship to Elena's disappearance if he could find the courage to pursue the truth regardless of where it might lead him. As Dr. Kim waited for his response to her proposal that they travel to North Carolina together, Marcus felt the weight of 4 decades of grief, guilt, and unanswered questions pressing down on him like a physical force. But he also sensed the presence of something he hadn't felt since the night Elena vanished, a genuine possibility that love and determination might still be strong enough to bridge the gap between loss and recovery, between past trauma and future healing, and between the broken family he'd been part of as a child and the complete family he'd never dared to hope he might someday be part of again. The decision to travel to North Carolina crystallized for Marcus during a sleepless night of wrestling with memories, possibilities, and the kind of profound uncertainty that had defined his relationship with Elena's disappearance for 4 decades. But what ultimately convinced him to take this leap of faith wasn't the hope of reunion or the promise of closure. It was the growing realization that Elena's story had become a pattern that repeated itself with disturbing regularity in his daily life, manifesting in ways he'd never consciously recognized, but which now seemed impossible to ignore. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while his mind churned through Dr. Kim's revelations about Dale Morrison, the underground protection network, and the community in Esperanza Springs that might have provided sanctuary for his sister, Marcus began to notice connections between Elena's disappearance and other incidents he'd witnessed over the years, both during his military service and in his current work as a security consultant. Situations where vulnerable people had vanished or been relocated under mysterious circumstances that he'd previously attributed to coincidence or bureaucratic confusion, but which now suggested the existence of ongoing protection networks that operated parallel to official law enforcement and social services. During his second deployment to Afghanistan, Marcus had been involved in several operations that required coordinating with local translators and informants who would suddenly disappear from their villages without explanation, leaving behind family members who claimed to know nothing about their whereabouts and who seemed genuinely frightened when questioned about the missing individuals. And while Marcus had initially assumed these disappearances were the result of Taliban intimidation or tribal conflicts, he now wondered whether some of these people might have been relocated through informal networks designed to protect those who had cooperated with American forces and who were therefore at risk of retaliation from insurgent groups. The pattern was remarkably similar to what Dr. Kim had described about the network that Isabella Restrepo had been part of. Vulnerable individuals who faced immediate threats being spirited away to safety by people who operated outside official channels, leaving behind families who were kept in the dark about their loved ones' fate in order to maintain operational security and prevent anyone from being forced to reveal information that could compromise the safety of those who had been relocated. Even more disturbing was Marcus's recognition that similar patterns had emerged in his work as a security consultant for local businesses in Cedar Falls, where he'd been hired to investigate several cases of employees who had simply stopped showing up for work without notice, leaving behind personal belongings and paychecks that were never claimed. And while his clients had typically assumed these were cases of job abandonment or family emergencies, Marcus now realized that some of these disappearances might have been emergency relocations designed to protect people who were facing domestic violence, stalking, or other threats that couldn't be adequately addressed through conventional legal remedies. One case in particular had involved Maria Santos, a young woman who worked at the grocery store and who had mentioned to her supervisor that her ex-boyfriend had been following her and making threats. And when Maria failed to show up for her shift the next day and couldn't be reached by phone, the store manager had simply assumed she'd found another job and hadn't bothered to follow up. But Marcus now wondered whether Maria might have been helped to disappear by people who recognized that she was in immediate danger and who acted to protect her before law enforcement could respond to her situation. The realization that he'd been surrounded by evidence of ongoing protection networks without recognizing their significance filled Marcus with a complex mixture of professional embarrassment and personal revelation, forcing him to confront the possibility that his focus on individual security measures and conventional threat assessment had blinded him to the existence of community-based protection systems that might be more effective at keeping vulnerable people safe than the official agencies and legal procedures he'd been trained to rely on during his military and civilian careers. This recognition also suggested that Elena's rescue might not have been an isolated incident from a bygone era, but rather part of an ongoing effort to protect children and families from dangers that conventional authorities were either unwilling or unable to address, and that the network Isabella Restrepo had been part of might still be operating in some form, continuing to provide emergency relocation services for people who needed to disappear in order to stay safe. Marcus's decision to accompany Dr. Kim to North Carolina was also influenced by his growing awareness that the disciplined isolation he'd maintained since retiring from the army had been motivated not just by grief and guilt about Elena's disappearance, but also by a deeper fear of recognizing other people's vulnerability and being called upon to provide protection or assistance that he might fail to deliver effectively, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of emotional detachment that had prevented him from developing the kinds of community connections that might have made him aware of the protection networks operating around him. His conversation with Tommy Hernandez had made him realize that many of his fellow veterans had struggled with similar issues, finding it difficult to transition from military service, where their protective responsibilities were clearly defined, and supported by extensive resources and training, to civilian life, where threats were often more subtle and complex, and where the systems designed to help vulnerable people were frequently inadequate or inaccessible to those who needed them most. The pattern recognition that had emerged from Marcus's reflection on Elena's disappearance extended beyond his professional observations to his personal relationships and community involvement, revealing a troubling tendency to avoid situations where he might be expected to provide emotional support or practical assistance to people who were facing difficult circumstances. And while he'd rationalized this avoidance as appropriate boundary setting and self-care, He now realized that it had also prevented him from developing the kinds of meaningful connections that could have enriched his life while also contributing to the informal support networks that helped keep communities safe and resilient. His neighbor, Mrs. Walsh, had mentioned several times over the years that she was concerned about other elderly residents who seemed isolated or struggling, and she'd asked Marcus to check on them occasionally or help with small repairs and maintenance tasks. But he'd consistently declined these requests, claiming that his work schedule and personal commitments made it impossible for him to take on additional responsibilities. Similarly, Father Santos had approached Marcus multiple times about volunteering with the church's outreach programs that provided assistance to immigrant families and individuals who were navigating complex legal and social challenges. And while Marcus had made financial contributions to these programs, he'd refused to become personally involved, citing his lack of relevant experience and his preference for maintaining professional boundaries between his security consulting work and his personal life. Looking back on these interactions, Marcus realized that his reluctance to engage with people who might need protection or assistance had been motivated not by practical concerns, but by the unconscious fear that he would fail them the same way he'd failed Elena, and that this fear had prevented him from recognizing opportunities to contribute to the kinds of informal protection networks that might have been operating in his own community. The most significant pattern that Marcus identified in his reflection on Elena's disappearance was his tendency to withdraw from relationships and situations where other people's safety and well-being might depend on his actions or decisions. A pattern that had shaped not only his choice to remain single and avoid romantic commitments, but also his reluctance to maintain close friendships, his minimal involvement in community activities, and his preference for work assignments that involved protecting property and assets rather than people who might be vulnerable to harm. This pattern had been so consistent and pervasive that Marcus had come to think of it as simply his personality or natural temperament. But Dr. Kim's research had made him realize that it was actually a trauma response that had prevented him from healing from Elena's disappearance, while also limiting his ability to the safety and well-being of other people who might benefit from his skills, experience, and resources. The decision to travel to North Carolina therefore represented not just an attempt to learn what had happened to Elena, but also a commitment to breaking the pattern of avoidance and emotional detachment that had defined his adult life, acknowledging that true healing from his childhood trauma would require him to risk forming new connections and taking on new responsibilities, even if those commitments might ultimately result in disappointment or loss. Marcus recognized that his military training and security expertise had given him knowledge and capabilities that could be valuable to protection networks like the one that had helped Elena, and that his financial stability and community standing could provide resources that might help other vulnerable people access the kind of emergency assistance that could save their lives or prevent them from being victimized by those who sought to exploit their vulnerabilities. The phone call to Dr. Kim to confirm his decision to accompany her to North Carolina was one of the most difficult conversations Marcus had ever initiated. Not because he was uncertain about his choice, but because verbalizing his commitment to pursue the investigation represented a fundamental shift in his relationship to Elena's memory and his own identity as someone who had been defined by loss and failure rather than hope and possibility. When Dr. Kim answered the phone, Marcus found himself struggling to find words that could adequately express the complexity of emotions and motivations that had led him to this decision, and he ultimately settled for a simple statement that carried the weight of 4 decades of grief, guilt, and carefully suppressed hope. "I'm ready to go to North Carolina. I need to know what happened to my sister, and I need to understand how I can be part of making sure other children don't have to go." through what Elena went through. Dr. Kim's response reflected her understanding of the magnitude of what Marcus was committing to, both in terms of the potential emotional impact of what they might discover and the broader implications of his decision to engage with issues and communities that he'd been avoiding since Elena's disappearance. And she spent nearly an hour discussing practical arrangements for their trip, while also helping Marcus think through the various scenarios they might encounter and the ways he could prepare himself emotionally and psychologically for whatever they might learn about Elena's fate. The conversation concluded with Dr. Kim's suggestion that Marcus consider this trip not just as an investigation into his sister's disappearance, but also as an opportunity to explore how his skills and resources might contribute to ongoing efforts to protect vulnerable people, framing their journey to North Carolina as the beginning of a new chapter in his life, rather than simply an attempt to find closure for an old trauma. As Marcus began making arrangements for the trip, requesting time off from his consulting work, asking Mrs. Walsh to collect his mail and keep an eye on his house, and packing the kind of clothes and equipment that would be appropriate for what might turn out to be an extended stay in an unfamiliar community, he found himself experiencing a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that he hadn't felt since his early days of military deployment, when the combination of fear and excitement about unknown challenges had created the kind of heightened awareness and emotional intensity that made every decision feel significant and every moment feel charged with possibility and danger. The journey to North Carolina began at dawn on a crisp Friday morning in late October, with Marcus loading his truck with enough supplies for what might be an extended stay, while Dr. Kim arrived punctually at 0600 hours carrying a leather briefcase containing copies of all her research, contact information for the people they hoped to meet, and a detailed map of Esperanza Springs that she'd obtained from Father Morales during their preliminary phone conversations. As they drove southeast through the changing landscape of America's heartland, Marcus found himself experiencing a strange combination of nervous energy and profound calm, as if the decision to finally pursue answers about Elena's fate had released some internal pressure that had been building for decades, allowing him to breathe more deeply and think more clearly than he had since Dr. Kim's initial visit had shattered his carefully constructed assumptions about his sister's disappearance and his own role in the tragedy that had shaped his entire adult life. The 12-hour drive to North Carolina provided an opportunity for Marcus and Dr. Kim to develop the kind of working relationship and mutual understanding that would be essential for navigating the complex emotional and logistical challenges they were likely to encounter in their investigation. And as the miles rolled by, Marcus found himself sharing memories and insights about Elena, his family, and the community dynamics in Cedar Falls that he'd never discussed with anyone before, while Dr. Kim explained more about her research methodology and her experience working with families who were searching for missing relatives or trying to understand historical mysteries that had affected their lives in profound and lasting ways. The conversation revealed that both of them had been shaped by experiences of loss and uncertainty that had motivated their current involvement in Elena's case. Dr. Kim had lost her own brother in a car accident when she was a teenager, and her decades of work in linguistics and historical research had been partially motivated by a desire to help other families find answers and closure that had been denied to her own family due to the circumstances surrounding her brother's death. Their first stop in North Carolina was a small diner on the outskirts of Esperanza Springs, where they met Father Antonio Morales, a man in his mid-70s whose weathered face and gentle eyes reflected decades of experience working with people who had faced unimaginable hardships and who had needed not just material assistance but Also the kind of spiritual and emotional support that could help them rebuild their lives after experiencing trauma, displacement, and loss. Father Morales explained that Esperanza Springs had been established in 1979 as an intentional community designed to provide long-term housing and support services for refugee families and individuals who had been relocated due to safety concerns, operating with funding from Catholic charities and private donors who understood that conventional social services were often inadequate for helping people who needed to disappear completely from their previous lives in order to stay safe from those who meant them harm. The community had housed approximately 200 people during its peak years in the early 1980s, including families from Central America who had fled civil wars and political persecution, women and children who had escaped domestic violence situations that couldn't be resolved through conventional legal remedies, and individuals who had been relocated through informal networks like the one Isabella Restrepo had been part of, creating a diverse but close-knit population united by their shared experience of having been forced to abandon their previous identities and connections in order to survive. Father Morales acknowledged that the community's commitment to protecting the privacy and anonymity of its residents had sometimes created painful situations for family members who were searching for missing loved ones. But he emphasized that this secrecy had been essential for maintaining the safety of people whose lives depended on their ability to remain hidden from those who had threatened them. When Marcus showed Father Morales the photograph of Elena that he'd carried in his wallet for 43 years, the priest's expression changed in a way that made Marcus's heart race with anticipation and fear. And after studying the picture carefully for several long moments, Father Morales nodded slowly and said that he did remember a little girl who had arrived at Esperanza Springs in late 1981 under circumstances that matched what Marcus and Dr. Kim had described about Elena's disappearance from the carnival in Cedar Falls. The child had been brought to the community by Isabella Restrepo, who had explained that the girl was in immediate danger from a predator who had been targeting children in her hometown, and that conventional authorities hadn't been able to provide adequate protection because the threat hadn't yet escalated to the level where criminal charges could be filed or protective custody could be justified through official channels. Father Morales described how the little girl had been traumatized not just by her separation from her family, but also by her awareness that she had been in danger, making her withdrawn and anxious during her first months at Esperanza Springs. But he also recalled that she had gradually begun to heal and adapt to her new environment with the help of a foster family who had specialized in caring for children who had experienced significant trauma and who understood the unique challenges of helping kids rebuild their sense of safety and identity after being relocated under such dramatic circumstances. The foster family, Miguel and Carmen Delgado, had been longtime residents of Esperanza Springs who had originally come to the community after fleeing Guatemala in the late 1970s, and who had dedicated themselves to helping other displaced children and families navigate the complex process of creating new lives while maintaining the cultural connections and personal values that gave their existence meaning and continuity. Revelation that Elena had indeed been brought to Esperanza Springs and had been cared for by people who understood her trauma and her need for protection filled Marcus with a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming emotion that made it difficult for him to process the additional information that Father Morales was sharing about his sister's life in the community and her gradual integration into a new family structure that had provided the stability and love she needed to heal from her experiences. Father Morales explained that Elena had been given a new name, Maria Elena Delgado, and had been enrolled in the local school where she had eventually excelled academically and socially, developing close friendships with other children in the community and participating in activities that had helped her rebuild her confidence and sense of belonging, while also maintaining the anonymity that kept her safe from the threats that had necessitated her relocation. As Father Morales continued to share his memories of Elena's time at Esperanza Springs, Marcus learned that his sister had grown up to become a teacher and community organizer who had dedicated her adult life to helping other displaced children and families access the resources and support they needed to rebuild their lives after experiencing trauma and forced migration, working with the same kind of informal networks that had rescued her from Cedar Falls, and continuing the mission of protection and healing that had been central to the Esperanza Springs community. Elena had married another community member, a man named Carlos Vega, who had also been relocated as a child due to safety concerns, and together they had raised 3 children while maintaining their commitment to serving vulnerable populations through their work with immigrant rights, organizations and child protection agencies that operated throughout the southeastern United States. The news that Elena was not only alive, but had built a successful and meaningful life dedicated to helping others who faced similar challenges, to those she had experienced as a child, created an emotional breakthrough for Marcus that was both overwhelming and liberating, finally answering the questions that had haunted him for 4 decades, while also revealing that his sister had not only survived her traumatic separation from their family, but had transformed that experience into a source of strength and purpose that had enabled her to make a profound difference in the lives of countless other people who had needed protection and support. Father Morales explained that Elena was now 51 years old and lived about 2 hours away from Esperanza Springs, where she directed a non-profit organization that provided emergency assistance to immigrant families and individuals who were facing deportation, domestic violence, or other threats to their safety and well-being. The priest acknowledged that Elena had occasionally asked about her original family over the years, particularly after her adoptive parents had died and after she had children of her own who raised questions about their extended family history. But she had also expressed ambivalence about making contact because she worried that her family might blame her for not reaching out sooner, or that reconnecting with her past might somehow compromise the safety and anonymity that had protected her for so many years. Father Morales suggested that Elena's reluctance to initiate contact might also reflect her concern about disrupting the lives of family members who had presumably moved on from their grief and built new relationships and commitments that might be complicated by her reappearance, and he emphasized that any reunion would need to be approached with extraordinary sensitivity to the complex emotions and practical considerations that would be involved for everyone concerned. When Father Morales asked if Marcus would like him to contact Elena and ask if she would be willing to meet with her brother, Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered, the possibility of seeing Elena again after 43 years of believing she was dead, the opportunity to finally tell her how sorry he was for failing to protect her, and the chance to learn about the life she had built and the family she had created while he had been mourning her absence and constructing his own existence around the assumption that he would never see her again. Through tears that he hadn't shed since the night Elena disappeared, Marcus managed to tell Father Morales that he would be honored to meet with Elena if she was willing, and that he wanted her to know that their parents had never stopped loving her and had died hoping that she was safe and happy somewhere, even if they never learned what had happened to her. The phone call that would determine whether Marcus would finally be reunited with his sister took place the following morning, with Father Morales explaining the situation to Elena, while Marcus and Dr. Kim waited anxiously in the guest house where they had spent a sleepless night discussing the implications of what they had learned and preparing for the possibility that Elena might not be ready or willing to reconnect with her original family. When Father Morales returned with news that Elena had agreed to meet with Marcus that afternoon, the priest also delivered a message that Elena wanted her brother to know. She had never forgotten him or their parents. She had always wondered if they blamed her for disappearing, and she had been hoping for 43 years that someday she might have the chance to see him again and tell him that she had built a good life and had tried to honor their family's values in her work, helping other people who needed protection and support. The reunion took place in the garden behind the community center at Esperanza Springs, where Elena arrived with her husband Carlos and their youngest daughter Sofia, a college student who had inherited her mother's commitment to social justice and who had been working as a volunteer coordinator for her mother's non-profit organization while finishing her degree in international relations. When Marcus saw Elena walking toward him across the garden, he immediately recognized the intelligent eyes and warm smile that had made her so beloved in their childhood. And despite the decades that had separated them and the dramatic changes in their circumstances, he felt the same protective love and fierce pride that had motivated his desperate search for her on the night she disappeared from the carnival in Cedar Falls. Their embrace was wordless but profound, communicating 43 years of grief, love, worry, and hope in a way that made formal explanations and apologies seem unnecessary. And as they sat together in the garden, sharing stories about their lives and families, Marcus realized that Elena had not only survived the trauma of their separation, but had transformed it into a source of strength that had enabled her to protect and nurture countless other children and families who had needed the same kind of emergency assistance that had saved her life when she was 8 years old. Elena explained that she had always planned to contact their parents and Marcus when she turned 18 and could make her own decisions about her safety and privacy. But by that time, their parents had already died, and she had been unsure about how to reach Marcus or whether he would want to reconnect with a sister who had caused so much pain and disruption in their family's life. Marcus spent the next hour telling Elena about their parents' love for her, their constant hope that she was safe and happy, and their pride in the values and character traits she had displayed as a child that had clearly continued to shape her adult life and work. And he also shared his own journey of healing from the guilt and trauma of losing her, his military service, and his gradual recognition that he needed to honor her memory by contributing to the protection of other vulnerable people rather than simply avoiding situations where he might face similar losses or failures. Elena responded by inviting Marcus to visit her home and meet her family, including her children, who had grown up hearing stories about their uncle Marcus and who had been curious about their mother's original family. And she also asked if he might be interested in volunteering with her organization, suggesting that his security expertise and military background could be valuable assets in their work, helping people who needed to disappear safely from dangerous situations. As the sun set over Esperanza Springs, Marcus found himself surrounded by the family he had never dared to hope he might regain. His sister Elena, her husband Carlos, their children, and Dr. Kim, who had made this miraculous reunion possible through her dedication to solving historical mysteries and helping families find closure and healing. The conversation that continued late into the evening covered not just their personal stories, but also their shared commitment to ensuring that other families wouldn't have to endure the kind of separation and uncertainty that had defined their lives for so many years, and Marcus realized that Elena's disappearance had ultimately led both of them to work that was meaningful and necessary, even if they had approached that work from different directions and through different experiences. This incredible story of loss, hope and family reunion reminds us that love transcends time and distance, that protection sometimes requires separation, and that healing can emerge from even the most devastating circumstances when people are willing to risk hope and pursue truth regardless of where it might lead them. Elena's story also demonstrates the power of informal networks and community support systems that operate parallel to official agencies, protecting vulnerable people through the kind of creative solutions and personal sacrifice that reflect the best of human nature and the enduring strength of families who refuse to give up on each other. If this story has moved you and reminded you of the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of human resilience, unexpected connections, and the miracles that can happen when people are willing to keep searching for truth and hope, even in the darkest circumstances.